All right, ladies and gentlemen, according to my watch, it is 7 p.m. So thank you very much for being here tonight. Civic Awareness Series, Critical Race Theory, what it is and what it isn't. My name is Will Bulig, Director of Operations for the Museums at Cantigny Park. Wow, what a great way to start the year. And if I can say Happy New Year, it's too late to do that, but Happy New Year to everybody. My job here is to introduce what you're going to experience tonight. Let's get started off with some logistics. This program, as you probably already have discovered, has closed captioning. And that closed captioning has a couple of options. If you don't like the closed captioning, on the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a button, live transcript, hide subtitles. That will make the closed captioning go away. But if you like closed captioning and you want it bigger or smaller, you go to subtitle settings. You can adjust the size of the font of that closed captioning. And tonight's presentation is a partnership between the League of Women Voters of Central Kane County, League of Women Voters of Wheaton, and the McCormick House. That's where I work, and it's a pleasure to have you all here tonight. Oh, one more thing about the closed captioning. It's kind of a fun thing. I always like to share the story. We like to say that the closed captioning is about 85% correct. So, some words just don't make the cut. And I guess it was October, November of last year, someone mentioned or said the word civic awareness. That's probably me, really. And it came across on the subtitles as civic weirdness. So it could be fun to see some of those words come across. Here we are, January 2022, starting off the year. And if you've been a participant in our events, whether they've been at the McCormick House in person or virtual through Zoom, I always like to connect the subject that we're talking about to our benefactor. Robert Rutherford McCormick, the Colonel, was editor and publisher of the Chicago Tribune, founder of WGN Radio and Television, and the namesake for McCormick Place. And we are at Cantigny right now, and Cantigny was Mr. McCormick's suburban estate. When Robert McCormick died in 1955, he died childless, and selfishly it was good for us because with no heirs to his fortune, he takes that and starts the McCormick Foundation and turns his Wheaton Farm into this great park that we've got today. So if you're in the area, you're probably familiar with Cantigny Park. It's a great place. I will say selfishly that, I work directly into at the McCormick House and the McCormick Museum. And again, if you've been a participant in this program, you know that the house is closed for renovation. And a lot of work is being done, a lot of progress is being made, and we are thinking about a late fall opening. So I'll keep you abreast of those challenges or and accomplishments, and we'll see. If COVID agrees, we'll start having some programs in the library again. Robert Rutherford McCormick, ran this newspaper, this media company, but he was very active politically. He was a conservative, and he was, if you want to have a dichotomy to Robert McCormick, it was FDR. Those two guys were diametrically opposed politically and personally. But Robert McCormick did enjoy debating, talking about politics and current issues. And a lot of those conversations took place in the house, in the dining room. He would invite folks specifically to have conversations. There's a story that when you came to have a meal with Robert McCormick, if you were engaged in a conversation, you would be there 3 to 4 hours because he loved having that give and take of conversation. So having conversations about current issues is exactly what Robert McCormick loved, and it's perfectly in line to what we're going to be talking about tonight. So enough of me. I want to hand it over to Barb, who's my contact, my partner with the League of Women Voters of Wheaton, who's done a lot of great work making this program what it is. So Barb, without any further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Will. I too would like to thank everyone for attending tonight's Civic Awareness Series on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Wheaton and Central Kane County, as we attempt to learn what critical race theory is and what it isn't. As Will has said, please enter any questions you have for Professor Laughlin-Schultz in the Q&A, and we'll ask as many as possible before the program ends tonight. I noticed that several people have clicked on their raise the hand icon. We will not be unmuting anyone during the program tonight. So if you have a question, a comment, or a concern, please feel free to enter it into the Q&A. Now, I am happy to call our presenter tonight, not only friend, I'm happy to call her friend, and to introduce her to you all. Professor Bonnie Laughlin-Schultz is a historian of the 19th century United States who specializes in American women's history. At Eastern Illinois University, she teaches the U.S. Survey, American women's history, Civil War era history, social studies teaching methods, historical research writing, and serves as a coordinator for the History with Teacher Licensure in social science. She also works with the Illinois Civics Hub as the Preservice Teacher Liaison and writes about civics teaching topics for IllinoisCivics.org. Bonnie received her undergraduate degree from Knox College and her PhD from Indiana University. Bonnie, thank you so much for joining us tonight and attempting to bring clarity to the subject of critical race theory, what it is and what it isn't. And the program is yours.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to so many of you for turning out tonight. I'm going to try to make it worth your time. So I think I've shared my screen here. Can you see it, Barb?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Perfect.
Awesome. So I'm framing tonight around three questions, sort of what is critical race theory, and really the opposite, sort of what isn't it in that way. And then this question of why we are hearing so much about it. And I imagine there are some folks in the country who are not listening and are not hearing anything about it, right? But if you were watching the news, particularly local news, as well as state and national news, we've seen scenes of angry debate, of shouting at school boards, of what I love Will's line about the closed caption with civic weirdness, right? Shouting is civic weirdness, right? That clearly is not what we're about tonight. And my goal really isn't to engage us in a debate or to be pro or anti, but rather to define it and sort of be thoughtful about what critical race theory is and why we are hearing so much about it, and to try, if we have time, to put it in the context of broader fights about US history, and particularly how we think and teach about the past. This last question is so interesting to me. I mean, I'm a US historian, as Barb said, a former high school teacher turned college professor. And I would say I've been thinking about history for about 40 years now, and particularly fascinated always by how we talk about the past, how we think about the past. So part of how I think about this question is really in my sort of nerd way of how we think and talk about the past. And again, as a historian, I have to show up with evidence, right? I've told you people are talking about this. Here's my evidence, in fact, that they are. This is just a bunch of selected news headlines. If you type in critical race theory and the word school, you can find your own array of headlines. Here, I've got a bunch of stuff about Missouri. I grew up in St. Louis, Rockwood School District, right in the southern part of St. Louis County. Lots of talk about them in the news in Missouri, and Missouri legislature in particular. Here I've got an Oklahoma bill talking about books, bills in Texas, and then this broader piece, critical race theory debate spurs bills banning schools teaching concepts that divide. We see our politicians talking about this, as well as school boards. I live in the Illinois 15th district, where there has been some talk about it, in particular about this idea of parents being in control of what students are exposed to. So it's not just a conversation about sort of what critical race theory is and the teaching of history, but sort of this contention about who's in charge of history too. And again, I find it all pretty fascinating. Here's a map. This is from Education Week back in June, that sort of gives us a map of the country that to me does not align perfectly with the state. So I labeled some that are close to us so we could sort of see this. Again, this from June, sort of showing some states where there had been state level action in the state legislature about the teaching of critical race theory or the teaching of history. Those two things sort of used interchangeably, even if we might say they're not exactly the same thing. Some states that are blue have had bills signed into law, including Texas. Some have been filed, the dark red. The pink, a bill has been pre-filed for the next legislative session, and then the yellow, a bill has been proposed or is moving through state legislature. And the state next to us, Indiana, this week joined the yellow list. So this is a map from June. So lots of other states in the mix now as well. The article in Education Week said 29 states have introduced bills or taken other steps along this line. And again, we see this not just in the headlines, but all over the news. This is a local news story from Stafford County, Virginia, where the school board was denouncing critical race theory, the 1619 project, as well as preferred pronouns, and lots of local news pieces that sort of feature, feature sort of parents on both sides of the divide expressing themselves. So tonight, what Barb asked me to do was to come and really think about what critical race theory is it being taught in the schools, and sort of what is the backstory for this. So the first question here is really that defining question: what is critical race theory? And so you guys, if you're coming here, you're probably in the know about this already, but I'll repeat it for everyone. The critical race theory is an academic concept, right? It's talked about by professors, by legal scholars, developed in the 1970s and the 1980s by legal scholars Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, a host of others. And legal scholars really drawn to create critical race theory in response to sort of talk about color blindness in law that was happening in the 1970s and the 1980s. With the belief that even laws that were said to be colorblind on the surface often had racial implications and racial inequities built into them. Sort of a later law that critical race theorists would look to as an example of this might be something like the stop and frisk policy that used to exist in New York City. That on the sort of face of it, when you read the law, it was really, or you read the policy, it was allowing police to stop and frisk people, but that in reality, this law was being used more towards Black people, people of color. And so critical race scholars said this color blindness thing isn't really working. And instead they laid out some other new frameworks. And again, as I said, really influential in a lot of academic departments and disciplines, from sociology to English to history, my home discipline, and particularly at the level of doctorate study and where those disciplines look to sort of read theory. When I was working on my doctorate in history, when you would have sort of the theory day in a class, that kind of thing. Here's another concise definition here from the Legal Defense Fund. The critical race theory, often shortened now to CRT, is an academic and legal framework. So both the academic and the legal framework, I think, are important to us for understanding this. That denotes that systemic racism is part of American society, from education and housing to employment and healthcare. Hence, that you cannot have colorblind policy when there is systemic racism. The definition continues here. It's embedded in laws, policies, and institutions that uphold and reproduce racial inequalities. And I wanted to bring in a couple of examples of sort of prominent pieces of writing of critical race theorists, not because we're going to read and dissect every word here, but to just sort of show, like, I'm a big fan of show and tell, right? This is what I'm giving you my bullet points that summarize it for you, but I also should show you the actual pieces. So this is a piece from Derek Bell, who's afraid of critical race theory. This was written in 1995 in the University of Illinois Law Review. So these pieces, this is not stuff that's showing up in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, my hometown newspaper, but rather in academic journals, typically kept behind paywalls. So here I have an arrow to a couple of sentences that I think are pretty good examples of the field from the perspective of critical race theory. Some positions have historically been oppressed, distorted, ignored, silenced, destroyed, appropriated, commodified, and marginalized, and all of this not accidentally. And then we see that word privilege. So the early phrasing we may not sort of roll off of our tongues in defining of this, but that word privilege. Second example, and both of these articles are findable on Google. So if you're interested in looking at the whole of them for yourself, you can find them. I think you can get to both of them. This one is from a book, Critical Race Theory, the Key Writing. So you can certainly access the book. And if anyone wants to get the original article, the legal one, I would be happy to make that available to people if you cannot get access to it. So the second one, Whiteness as Property, that was in this book, Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings, that came out in the mid-90s, really an anthology of sort of the most important, most prominent pieces here. And again, sort of just to give you a flavor of what the writing is like in this highly theoretical field. The law masks as natural what is chosen. It obscures the consequences of social selection as inevitable. The result is that distortions in social relations are immunized from truly effective intervention. So this is a lot of words, right? What does it really add up to? What are the key ideas here? So number one, I would say, and this is a piece that has really been influential or had a great influence on the writing of history, that race is what we call, or what historians call and other scholars call, a social construct. That is, that ideas of race are created. Race is not biologically innate, but we attach meaning to differences that are perceived in people. The other thing that historians point out about race, and critical race theorists as well, is that race itself, the idea of race, the concept of race, has a history, particularly in the Americas. There is a great, I know there are some teachers on here, probably a lot of you are familiar with a documentary and an accompanying PBS site called Race, the Power of an Illusion. It's an older work, it's great. I use parts of it when I teach, and they sort of lay out in their early website. And again, you can get to this online if you would like, sort of this idea of difference. And then this idea that what race really is the stories that we tell about difference, and that we haven't always told the same stories, and we don't tell the same stories in the same places. So that idea of race as not innate, but rather as constructed, is one of the key insights. Second piece here, and this came out more in the examples that I showed you, that racism is not just individual. That is, it isn't about whether I am a racist or have racist beliefs or engage in racist practice, but that racism is bigger than that, that it is embedded in the legal system, in policies and structures, giving rise to this term systemic racism that we saw in one of the examples that I showed you. The third point I would make about sort of key ideas is that critical race theory positions itself as a way to better understand why the world is as it is. So why things are as they are, with an eye to history, and certainly with an eye to the future, right? That this better and nuanced understanding of the past, of the whys, of the modern, of the present, are key to understanding the future and the key to making change, right? Most critical race theorists are writing because they have an idea of a future that is change. Finally, this idea of intersectionality, which may be a word that you are familiar with or not, this idea of overlapping and multifaceted identities. And I am not sure if when I shared my volume. So this is a 45-minute, a 45-second video clip, and I'm going to attempt to play it. If we can't hear it, we'll move on. And maybe, okay, thank you for letting me know. So what Kimberly Crenshaw says here, and I was hoping to let you hear from her herself, since she's one of the key early theorists of CRT. What she talks about is just sort of the multiple identities that people have. And this is a video that she recorded for the National Association of Independent Schools, and sort of thinking about how this shows up in schools in in particular. And so one of the things that she talked about was the suspension rate of young Black female students, right? And that it was, I think the stat that she quotes in this is 6 times that of white female students, and sort of looking at how it's not just sort of a racial identity, but also maybe ideas about gender and how what girls are and should do or whatever that are present in that. So that's the best example that I can think of to define what critical race theorists think when mean when they're talking about intersectionality. So the other question here, we've sort of got a sense of what critical race theory is, and then by sort of definition, what it is not. But are K-12 classrooms places where critical race theory is taught? I'm going to explain my no and my asterisk here carefully. So when we look at this example I gave you, it's very clear, right? I don't give this to my undergraduate students. I don't give this to my master's degree students in history. It's not that critical race theory is at all being assigned or taught specifically in schools. That's not particular. And to be honest, I have a PhD in history. I've read a lot of theory about history and hadn't read much critical race theory in the course of my education to get a PhD in history. There are some historians who read a lot more of it, particularly historians of American slavery, but it isn't sort of being widely taught all over the place. That said, a lot of these insights, so critical race theory has been around since the 70s and 80s, and I would say over the decades, the past 4 to 5 decades, some of the ideas of critical race theory have been sort of boiled down, distilled down, simplified, made more accessible, and made their way into the broader conversation. And an example that I think of when I was planning this talk was this book. And we don't have a chat, so I can't poll the folks who are here to see how many folks have read this book or are familiar with this book. The New Jim Crow came out over 10 years ago now, was a bestseller, lots of talk about this, and lots of talk about mass incarceration. And at the time, it was an explosive book, right? It grabbed people's attention, lots of folks reading it. When you read it today, some of it seems very, well, yeah, we already were hearing about this. And some of that is clearly the impact of this book. But in this book, Michelle Alexander talks about mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness. So we see that word colorblindness, and also this idea of the carceral state as a new version of Jim Crow, linked to sort of systems of racism, not individual acts of racism. So we see sort of some of the impact of critical race theory. I don't know that Michelle Alexander read all kinds of critical race theory writing this book at all. That isn't what I'm saying. I'm saying that some of the ideas are sort of distilled and have become more mainstream. Other one here is, and it's come from other folks, not just CRT folks, is sort of people talking about privilege, right? This is a news headline coming out of Tennessee. Actually, I used to work with teachers in North Carolina, and this was pretty near where I lived. I lived in Western North Carolina, a school in sort of the very eastern part of Tennessee, where a Tennessee teacher taught a Ta-Nehisi Coates essay, talked to students about privilege, about white privilege, ultimately lost his job. It's a really interesting story. If you Google it, you will find the story of this teacher and him sort of talking about his hopes for what he had thought he was doing, the objections to it, ultimately what happened to him. And this is an example of sort of how critical race theory has become part of the sort of swirl, or ideas about critical race theory in the swirl around how we're talking about education, what teachers should be doing, what history is, all of this. And at this point, I'll come back to our map here. Again, sort of thinking about this as a historical moment where we are seeing a lot of action happening in state legislatures in particular to talk about the teaching of history, to talk about critical race theory and if it should or should not be allowed in schools. I don't know how much you know or how sort of eyes on the ground you are to all the other states around us or nationwide about some of the initiatives going on there, but we see there's a lot. And both Education Week and the LDF sort of gave some bullets where they summarized, like if we're taking a lot of these different legislative efforts and sort of putting them into different buckets, these are the buckets that they have come up with. So a couple of things. Quoting from a few of the bills, a requirement that teachers teach without giving deference to any one perspective and to provide a counter narrative or opposing view of anything being taught. And we see some sort of oddities that come out of this. They always seem to involve the Nazis and Hitler, but on the whole, there is this sort of impulse towards teachers need to show both sides of everything that is making its way into state legislatures. Second, bans on teaching that the United States is inherently or fundamentally racist. And the sort of idea here is that is what critical race theorists are saying. I don't know if that's how I would interpret all their writings. I don't know what individual critical race scholars would say about this, and if there is a distinction between inherently, that is, there are things around the origins, or fundamentally, I don't know, but this is one of the ways in which we are talking about critical race theory. Third, bans on divisive concepts such as white supremacy, white privilege, equity, unconscious or implicit bias, systemic racism, these showing up in some of the state bills, one particularly in New Hampshire right now that is aimed at putting teachers under a microscope for teaching the divisive concepts. I think the Indiana law has something to do with this as well. Bans on discussion of systemic racism and sexism that would discriminate or hurt feelings or make someone, meaning students, feel guilty. And then limits and funding cuts for anti-bias training and diversity and inclusion initiatives for students and teachers. The Stafford County, Virginia School Board that I referenced as one of my early examples of critical race theory and all this being in the news. One of the things that effort talks about is not giving funding to schools, to teachers that are doing this work. And again, the example from our neighboring state of Indiana, this just from last week, I think, Indiana Senate Bill 167 to limit conversations on race, on politics in school. It's interesting here, sort of the news article doing this, we want to show sort of both sides. So it receives mixed opposition, and then they give some of that. But the bill's author, Senator Scott Baldwin, said part of his intent is for teachers to present issues in a neutral way, prevent division, not to limit how schools teach. Another history teacher sort of saying, well, there are some things, my Nazi example, that teachers aren't going to be neutral about. In Illinois, and this is the only slide I have about this because I think you all are going to have a future speaker on this, but the conversation gets a little confusing because the Illinois legislature has also introduced something called the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards that really are aimed not at K-12 students, but at teacher preparation in the state. And that CRT is not the same as critical race theory CRT. So sometimes folks talk about one and they mean the other and the like. Culturally responsive teaching in a nutshell really is more about thinking about the identities and experiences and expertise that the students in our classes bring to them and trying to reach all of them by being culturally responsive. That is thinking about what is going to improve learning for all of our students, thinking about culture, thinking about instructional technique, this kind of thing. And I suspect we'll be hearing a lot more about this in our state in upcoming months. But back to the other CRT that you invited me here to talk about tonight. Again, back to these samples, bans on any discussion or teaching that the United States is inherently or fundamentally racist. And this is one that has showed up a lot in the news and sort of, like one of the things that, so I've been teaching history a while now. And one of the things that we think and talk about with our students is sort of the complexity of the past, right? Just today, I was telling my US history survey students that the class is not preparation for Jeopardy, right? That the class, in fact, may prepare them for Jeopardy, but that isn't what we're doing when we study history. We're thinking about broad issues. We're thinking about complexity. We're thinking about the messiness of the past. We're making arguments with historical evidence, all of that. It's hard to put that kind of history in a nutshell, though, right? It doesn't easily tweet that kind of thing. And I think that's part of what's going on in our public sphere, right? That we're trying to have these hard and complicated discussions, but that is hard to do in the land of social media and that kind of thing. And so we wind up seeing discussions that are framed more around something like this. This from an Ohio representative, teach your kids about 1776, not 1619. And I don't put this up here to pick on him at all, but rather that these are 2 years that are very much in the news, in the mainstream, right? Everyone here knows 1776. I sure, for the love of God, hope, right? That we are all interested in history. We have had history. A lot of talk over the past 2 years about 1619. And particularly about the 1619 project that the New York Times produced in 2019. 400 years from the arrival of 20 enslaved Africans in Jamestown, sort of a commemorative project for that first came out in the New York Times Magazine and then evolved into a set of resources that some large school districts have adopted for use, and now just recently came out in book form. And I was thinking about this today in terms of thinking about what is it that we actually are teaching in classrooms versus these kind of conversations. And so I thought, again, what I would like to do is sort of a show and tell. And this time I'll put the microscope on myself and sort of think about what is it that I'm doing in the classroom when I think about 1619. And this is not to say, I mean, there's a whole nother conversation that could be had about the New York Times 1619 project, right? Which has been widely read, widely talked about, widely debated. If you put 1619 project into Twitter, you could read the rest of your life, right? But in terms of thinking about the way that historians engage with 1619. So this is part of a PowerPoint slide that I've used in years past when I teach the US history survey. We haven't gotten to Jamestown this semester, so I haven't yet figured out how I'm going to modify this slide for class. But sort of this notion that 1619 was a really complicated and fraught year in the history of Virginia. That we note the arrival of 20 enslaved Africans. It's sort of a cryptic note in a document to Jamestown. Not a lot of talk about what that means at the time. And we know, historians, students of history know, that it takes a long time from 1619 to build the system of American slavery that we imagine. We often imagine sort of slavery in the antebellum South, that when slavery arrived in the US, that is exactly how it snapped into being, and that's not the case. But in Virginia in 1619, we also see the creation of the House of Burgesses, this representative body. And this historical paradox, this interesting connection that the ideals of sort of colonial liberty, the rights of Englishmen, John Locke, all of this develop at the same time that we see the origins of what will become a perpetual race-based slavery encoded into law. The book I reference here is a great one if you're interested in this topic. Edmund Morgan, it's a classic. It was written, I think, in the 70s or 80s, but called American Slavery, American Freedom. And really, in some ways, he is examining 1619, although his book tells a much longer story. But this idea of how is it that these two things emerge side by side. And when he calls here the ordeal of colonial Virginia in other of his writings, he refers to this moment as this American paradox. And I say all of that to say that, I come to critical race theory and I come to these conversations that are ongoing right now as a historian and as somebody who reads and writes and thinks about how history is presented, how we interact with it in the public sphere. I believe fervently that history, the kind of history that I write for other scholars, is not where history, that is, yes, I love doing that. It's part of my job. It's part of my joy. But we all want to be engaged in talking about history. And it's interesting to me just to think about the many ways, the many times, the many facets of our national fight about history, what the story of our nation is, how it should be taught, and that this has been going on for a long time. And this moment does in fact feel particularly fraught, particularly loud. This is one of the difference between the battles now and the battles in the past, that we have social media to sort of amplify and also to silo us in some ways. But there is a long story of the battle over history in the United States. Historians would probably begin this with the history wars about the Civil War. Why was it fought? Why did it start? What was its meaning, right? And those wars start in 1865, right? The war is not even over. Maybe they even start 1863, 1861. The war is not over and people are already fighting over what it means, right? And that obscurity of Van Lincoln's second inaugural address near the end of the war, where he has this very weird passive clause where he says slavery was somehow the cause of the war. And folks have been fighting about that ever since. We see fights about history and the teaching of history in the early 20th century, and again in the Cold War, about patriotic history, about the need to educate, about capitalism and communism. Cleaning out my grandfather's house years ago, I found these pamphlets from some reading group he must have participated in 1961. And one of them was Capitalism versus Communism, What You Need to Know. Those kinds of things. In the 1990s, there were battles over the national history standards that never went on to be enacted. Whose history should be included in the national history standards? What is the point of history? What is that overall narrative of American history? And then this modern debate on Confederate monuments that we've watched play out in a wildly fascinating way. It's sort of a history moving very quickly in the past few years. This image from Richmond, Virginia, showing a Robert E. Lee monument that now the Lee has been removed from that monument, and local activists projecting an image of Harriet Tubman on it, putting those two figures side by side in a really interesting way. So I would say, it's important for us as folks in the world to sort of think of this conversation as part of this broader and longer conversation that we've had about our history. I'm starting to work on a book that actually predates all of these history wars. I've become convinced that even before the Civil War, we're sort of fighting about our history. I taught a Civil War class last spring, and one of the examples that I found, I'd never seen this before, and it just unpacked all kinds of things for me as a scholar and thinker about how we think about the past. Robert Purvis was an African-American abolitionist writing in The Liberator, so William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery newspaper in 1862, so year 2 of the Civil War, when talk about colonization of once enslaved people and even free African Americans was still in the talk, still even in a bit of Lincoln's head, right? And he says, in opposition to colonization, great God, is justice nothing, is honor nothing, is even pecuniary interest to be sacrificed to this insane and vulgar hate. He meant belief that was promoting colonization. It is said this is the white man's country. Not so, sir. This is the red man's country by natural right, and the black man's by virtue of his suffering and toil. And then he goes on to sort of tell this story of Black people in America, and he ends with, we planted ourselves upon our inalienable rights, and we're proof against all the efforts that were made to expatriate us. And the phrase that really grabbed me when I saw this was this bit about this was the red man's country and the black man's country, particularly just because there has been such a national conversation about what are the ideas of the 1619 Project, what are the ideas of critical race theorists, and to see folks talking about that in the sort of public sphere, right? The Liberator is not everyone in America is reading it, right? You have to be sort of sympathetic or really looking to hate read, I guess. You know, abolitionism, to be reading The Liberator in 1862, you need to be of a certain ability to access that, but this is in conversation way in our past. The last thing I wanted to draw attention to in some of the conversation about critical race theory and what's happening in schools are these kind of words that show up: guilt and discomfort and hurt feelings. And when I think about my own teaching of history, I think about those moments when students seem to engage with history in their gut and not in their head, and sort of feel it there, and they get quiet and they talk about these things. And we see words like guilt and hurt feelings and discomfort in some of this legislation. And the interesting thing to me in recent years, particularly in Illinois, and Barb mentioned that I've done work with civics teachers here, is how much work there is, how much interesting stuff there is out there about this topic and how it exists in classrooms and what teachers are able to do with it, whether that's social studies writers or social studies scholars like Paula McAvoy and others calling sort of productive discomfort. That is all discomfort. The same in the classroom, how we work with students when they encounter what David Pace and others title emotional bottlenecks. That is those moments where they encounter history in their stomach and they just sort of are like, this is making me uncomfortable. And I don't like how that feels. And then to just note, as a teacher myself, how many resources there are out there for teachers to do this work thoughtfully and with great care. You know, about 10 years ago when I started running, excuse me, the social studies program at EIU, you know, I was like, well, I need to train my students on how they can do this hard stuff. What do I do when students get uncomfortable? I got to figure this out. And lo and behold, there's all kinds of stuff out there for teachers. And those of you who are teachers, I suspect know this and make use of the great resources out there. The other thing I've been thinking about in teaching the past few years as conversation has played out is sort of this question about what students want. And I think it's a complicated mix, but I think many students are very comfortable with nuanced history. I teach a class on the history of Illinois, and it's largely comprised of students who are going to be elementary school teachers. And last year I used a book about the Chicago race riot of 1919 because I thought it was important for them to know and learn about. I did a lot of work to sort of be thoughtful in how we talked about it. And almost to a student, the student's response to it was, how did I not know about this before? And believing that knowing about it would have changed their understanding of the modern world. And I just found that very, very interesting against the sort of backdrop of this modern moment. And I wanted to close with a quote from, this is a framework, a proposed framework, Educating for American Democracy. It is a very conscientiously bipartisan framework. That is, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives very conscientiously work together to create this sort of design for how we can teach history and civics and intertwine those things. And they have this question embedded in it, which I think maybe is a question that is a question that's arising out of this talk about critical race theory and about the work of teachers. How can we offer an account of the US constitutional democracy that is honest about the wrongs of the past without falling into cynicism, appreciative of the founding of the United States without tipping into adulation? And I think, you know, for me as somebody who, again, is a nerd, is a historian, and just loves to sort of think about how we talk about history. It is also, frankly, you know, protective of teachers, right? That teachers work hard to do good work in our classrooms and that they're working harder than ever. You know, this is an interesting thing. So thank you. I'm supposed to sort of do a very good job of segueing into the Q&A, and I didn't do a good job at all. I just sort of said thank you and and hit me with your questions, but I do have my email address here and those links I referenced. If anyone would like them, I'd be happy to send those to you. I'm going to leave this up for a minute and then I'll stop sharing my screen.
Oh, thank you, Bonnie. We do have some questions for you. So we'll try and be mindful of our time that we do usually end at 8 o'clock. So let me get right on with the questions. Joanne asked a question of what vision do you see our theorists have of the future? Can you give us any indication of where they're heading with this theory at the legal and college level?
I mean, I think, and I don't mean to sound sort of naive, I think that it's just the idea of a more equitable world, that if we better understood sort of all the systems in place, that we would be able to create a world where opportunity existed for more folks.
Excellent. Karen was asking that she has seen the acronym CRT used to mean culturally responsive teaching, which she briefly spoke about, and which we'll have a program next week to help explain that to people. But maybe a little more information tonight would be helpful for tonight's audience. Has the fact that some school districts have approved culturally responsive teaching been exploited to suggest that these districts are teaching critical race theory? Is there a basic confusion between the CRTs,
I think there is. I'm sure some people really have their head wrapped around which one they're upset about. And I mean, they are not at all the same thing. There is a little, if we were doing a Venn diagram, there's a little bit of overlap between them. I think it is very unfortunate for culturally responsive teaching in this moment that is its acronym, because I think it does sort of muddy the waters, and that folks are really talking about the other thing that they've heard so much about and are mad about, but they're saying this is what they're mad about. Yeah, well, no, I'm excited that you guys are having a program next week.
Yeah, I think that you said it well, is that culturally responsive teaching is directed toward teacher preparation, while CRT is directed towards legal and philosophical findings and musings, correct? I mean, would that be a good distinction, simplified?
Yes, absolutely. That's great. And interesting that neither of them really are directed at K-12, although who is teaching in K-12 obviously has more of an effect.
Okay. Mary Lou was asking the question about how are other prejudices and privileges between other races, and I'll add the word cultures, incorporated into CRT, and is there a global concept approach, or is it just isolated to the USA black-white focus?
That is a great question. And I have to be honest, I have not read examples that sort of speak to a global, but I don't feel like I'm smart enough to say that isn't there and I'm just not seeing it. I think some of the idea of critical race theory is that, there is a phrase from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a Black abolitionist, fighter for women's rights in the 19th century, where she says we are all bound up together. And at the time, she's talking to white women advocating for women's rights and saying, you got to fight for all the rights. Like we can't separate out any one equality, that we have to sort of level the playing field for everyone. And so I would think that's the way where I see critical race theory intersecting with that question, right? And sort of other inequities, other groups, all of that. I think the part that is shown up in our popular discourse is the part that is most interested in Black and white in America, for sure.
Well, and that kind of leads into Mark's question, because he asks, is the social construct of race the view of color more than national or other forms of identity?
I don't see it that way. But when I think about the social construct of race, I am thinking of it very specifically in how I think of it in teaching, and folks who write about it in the teaching of history are thinking about the creation of the very specific form of slavery that exists in the Americas and North America, and thinking about the way that meaning is put onto Blackness, the way that folks write about Black women in particular in the 17th century, and sort of have these assumptions about them that then set up systems of inferiority and sort of justify slavery. And so that's how that is when I'm talking about that, I'm thinking of it more in history. But I think the best way to think of it is sort of just this meanings that we assign to difference, right? People will also talk about gender in this way, that gender is constructed, and that is the meaning that we assign to biologically female, biologically male. There was a show at the Free to Be You and Me in the 1970s, and there's an example from that. It's a song about how William wants a doll. And when I teach my women's history class, I use that to show gender construct, right? William wants a doll, but William shouldn't want a doll because he's a boy and boys don't want dolls. So that kind of thing.
Well, Kelly was wondering, what advice could you give to help people address others' concerns about CRT when this issue is raised? Is there kind of an elevator speech that we could give to help them understand and calm fears, or create, clear up misperceptions of what's the two CRTs? Or
I think there is, I think one aspect of it is the sort of why do we study history talk. And one of the things that I use with my students sometimes is you ask them on the first day, why do we study history? And half the class gives us, those of you who are teachers might find this a little bit cliched, but we learn about the past, so we avoid all the mistakes, right? But that is sort of an inherently, we use history to make meaning of the present. And I think, and to make the present world better, that by understanding things better, we have a better ability to shape our world. And I think that might be my elevator speech. And that, that critical race theorists, on the one hand, they are out to change the world. And we can't deny that some people like the world as it is. And so that is a point of conflict, right? And reasonable and unreasonable people are debating those questions. And maybe there are some elevator talks that descend into shouting because of that. But I think this thinking about, it's a theoretical construct to better understand why the United States is the way it is now, and to think carefully about past and future. And most people think that being more nuanced and complicated and messy in our understanding of things deepens our understanding. Like and I think people like this idea of we are not meant to comprehend the world in a tweet, right? That we need to be having deeper, richer, more thoughtful, more evidence-based discussions, that we cannot summarize anything meaningful in a tweet, even though, I love Twitter, I'm not gonna lie. But, I think people understand, and I think people also understand, and certainly our students understand, that the adults out there are not doing it right, that we want a better world than what we see, and we want a better way to engage in thoughtful deliberation and to think about discussion rather than debate, and really bringing back the idea of listening and trying to understand what people think. And I think that all of that, I don't know that I gave you like a great 30 seconds, say this in an elevator, but I think all those ideas people can agree with. And I think we also can agree with, we want all of our students to have a great education, and all of us want students to know and think about history. We might have different ideas about that, but maybe this can give us some insights into that. And the teachers are really working hard to do this in careful ways. Like the idea that teachers are sort of celebrating guilty feelings of a party, that is not what is happening. And maybe exposure to the nuanced ways that this is going on is useful too.
excellent. Magda asks this question. It's kind of a convoluted question. It's got several parts. So I'll try and read slowly for you. Would you see racism as a manifestation of tribalism? If yes, isn't tribalism something that humanity had or has for centuries, millennia? There is an issue in USA of being embedded in laws, health, care, everyday issues, but considering other groups inferior is present in multiple societies, past and present. And she's wondering if she's totally wrong. What would you say?
I think that's a great question. I think this point that in the broad history of the world, we have always had inequity, prejudice, we've always had meaning attached to difference, right? That those are great points. I think a lot of these scholars would say there is a specificity to what happened with the development of American slavery, right? And a lot of times when we're talking about critical race theory, we can't not talk about American slavery, right? Because that is the sort of beginning of what those scholars would think about as systemic racism. So I think there is a more specific story to tell about the United States, and that it is not as simple as tribalism and all people discriminate and all people are prejudiced. I do think that is true. I'm sure that we could tell sort of parallel stories of things that happen in other places as well, though. Thank you.
Kelly is wondering, what are some of the books you would recommend for teachers dealing with emotional bottlenecks? Is there any way you could make a resource list to share with us? And she would really appreciate it. And so, you know, if you thought that was possible, Bonnie, I could send it out to the attendees who we'd have their email addresses when they signed up. So do you think that would be possible?
Oh, absolutely. I would love to make that list. There are great books about the teaching of particular topics. There are also a lot of resources on the web. Teaching Tolerance, which has renamed itself as Learning for Justice, they have a framework called a Framework for Teaching Hard History that talks a lot about American slavery, but that also has great ideas for general conversations about things. So I'm going to make y'all a list that is sort of two parts, sort of teaching and history about particular topics, as well as sort of these more general approaches and strategies that are useful.
Thanks. I mean, that would be really appreciated. We'll give you a few days to put that together. Dan made a comment, and I don't know if you want to agree or just comment on it. He said, it seems to me that a key concept here is whose stories are being told and who gets to tell the stories. That's kind of been a debate in history for a while, I think, as a former social studies teacher, correct?
Yeah. No, I think you are spot on. That sort of whose stories are we writing about when we write about the American past? Who counts as American, right? I mean, my quote from the Liberator, Robert Purvis in 1862, is sort of planting his flag and saying, I'm an American, I count in this story. And so I certainly think that is true. And that certainly was part of the discussion about the national history standards in the 1990s as well.
He just posted another comment that said, Michael Landis has asked, are you fighting for the country that was or the country that will be? Which patriot are you?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to frame it. I'm going to include on this reading list, there was also a great short piece by a history professor in the Washington Post last year that I used with my students this morning. And sort of what he talks about is, we're not actually in the business of patriotic education. We're in the interest of understanding our country. It's not that we as teachers of history are thinking about, is history meaning you to love or hate your country, but rather you have this obligation to understand it. And maybe that's saying the same thing as Landis is saying in a different way. But I think students are very attracted to that, right? As much as, again, that's a more complicated discussion of the past.
Bonnie, I know it's 8 o'clock. Do you have time for maybe 2 more questions and then we'll let you go? Thank you. Okay, so Christian has asked, he listened to a podcast about CRT and it was simplified into 2 parts. Race is a social construct and white superiority racism is embedded in many foundational systems and institutions of America. Would you agree with that synopsis?
Yeah, yes. I think the idea of race as constructed and race as something, what I said at the beginning, that when we talk about racism and when we see a lot of people who are uncomfortable with this and react to it, this idea is that I am not a racist and you called me a racist, right? But that CRT is actually not really about us individuals. We're individuals who are sort of cogs in a machine in some ways, and it's the machine that we're examining. So I am comfortable with that, I have to say. I'm sure there are things we should add to be thorough and thoughtful, but yeah, I'll go with it.
Well, I think it just cleared up for me. It was important what you said is that it's about the machine, not about individuals. I mean, and that seems to be a huge distinction that perhaps we're missing when we talk about cultural race theory, is that we're talking about the machine and us just being part of that machine. Okay, one last question. How can we confidently say that CRT is not being taught in K-12 schools? And if it isn't, why are states trying to pass bills to block the teaching of CRT at those levels?
So I think it is an interesting question because, as I said, no teacher is going in and saying, let's read this piece of critical race theory. But some of the distilled down ideas they shape how history is written, right? And so inherently that's making its way a little bit into K-12. I actually think, I was thinking about this earlier today, that a lot of these bills and a lot of what they're talking about is that debate about whose history counts, right? What are we going to focus on? That simplified idea of we need an education in history that highlights the things for us to feel proud of, and that we need to avoid history that makes us feel bad. And I wonder if a lot of these bills are actually about feelings rather than facts. And that is an interesting thing going on, right? And particularly to be sort of blunt, about the feelings that we imagine white students having in response to history. And I think that, we can have a lot of good discussion about all kinds of things, but that's an important facet, that when we talk about guilt, we're generally talking about how white students in the room are going to feel.
Okay, one last question. Is not one of the big issues that activists, not necessarily historians or teachers, are using CRT significantly to promote change in American culture?
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
So not necessarily being taught, but some are using it for change.
Yeah, and I mean, we see, a lot of the sort of talk and maybe we could call it backlash against social studies, civics in Illinois, again, is this idea that we're teaching students to change the world, that is, our students as change makers, or that kind of action civics, right? I think a lot of that conversation can be put in the same, did I say buckets, or in the same bucket?
Silence buckets.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, Bonnie, thank you so much. There are other questions that people have asked, but our time has run out. There's also been a request for us to repost your email address. And if it's okay with you, I'll just send it out in the follow-up email regarding this program. So Thank you so much for your time and your effort in helping us try and understand CRT, what it is and what it isn't. And now I'll turn the program over to Judy Beaver, our president of the Wheaton League of Women Voters.
Thank you, Barb, and a big thank you to Dr. Bonnie Laughlin-Schultz. We appreciate your insight. It's an important topic to learn about and to have conversations. So thank you. And thanks to our audience. We appreciate your engagement. I also want to thank Cantini and a sister league, League of Women Voters of Central Kane County. So please join us next week. The League of Women Voters of Wheaton is beginning a local civic engagement series this year that will meet on the third Thursday of the month. We've already talked about it a little bit. Next Thursday's kickoff program is Know the Difference Between Critical Race Theory and Culturally Responsive Teaching. So it's an excellent program to follow up to this evening's program. A panel of local educators will discuss why culturally responsive teaching is important. how it applies to the classroom, and the confusion regarding culturally responsive teaching and critical race theory, because as we've said, they share the same initial CRT. Please register on our website to join us virtually next Thursday. Everyone is welcome. Also, our next Civic Awareness Program is Thursday, February 10th at 7 p.m. We'll hope you join us for that next month as well. Details will be on our website, wheatonlwvil.org, and Cantini's website, cantini.org. So thank you again, and good night, everyone. Thanks.